Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figure It Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and today we're going to be talking about this. This is the RGB Blaster for the Nintendo Famicom. Before we do that though, if you guys could do me a favor, if you could like this video, comment down below, subscribe if you've never done that before, and check out all the social media stuff in the description. I've got Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Patreon, Spreadshirt, my new travel channel called Flying and Eating, whole bunch of stuff, whole bunch of ways you can support me. I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. And speaking of people who did support me, we got shout out to StoneAgeGamer.com, because full disclosure on this, of course, they sent this to me for free for the purposes of review, just so you guys could see it in action. So I've been making videos on stuff that they've had for years. It's a great website, lots of cool things over there, and they really distribute a lot of really cool products, and this is definitely one of them, and I'm looking forward to talking all about it. But if you want to get this or any of the other stuff that they have, there will be a link in the description. Go ahead and check them out. So thank you to Stone Age Gamer. Now, what is the RGB Blaster? This is pretty much defines niche, but I think that's what's so awesome about it. So basically, this was made by Krizz. Krizz is the guy who makes the EverDrives, you know, the flash cards. I actually have one sitting right there just to represent him. Thank you, Krizz, for everything that you do. And fun fact, yes, this will work on the RGB Blaster in case anybody was curious. So the RGB Blaster is basically a product that really addresses a very specific niche problem that I just think is awesome. It's exactly the kind of thing I love to cover. When Nintendo launched the Famicom back in 1983, they obviously had a massive hit on their hands, but one of the things they didn't care about was future-proofing the video quality. The system launched with RF only, and really had nothing else under the hood. When they redesigned it for North America, they would at least give you composite video out of it, and then in Japan they would release the Sharp Twin Famicom, which had composite video, as well as this is the AV Famicom that also had composite video on it. Ironically, this is the same basic design we had for the NES top loader, except in our case they took the composite off and only put RF on it. Nintendo had this need to just make everything stupid. But anyway, so as a result, if you wanted to play the Famicom or the NES in modern times, there's a bunch of options, but there's nothing that's really all that perfect for it, just because on the one hand, the NES at least is a very unreliable machine, and then if you wanted the Japanese versions, you would have all sorts of problems. Like the Famicom used its Japanese RF, which meant that it was looking for channel signal number, channel 1, which isn't even like a thing on North American television. So you could get it to work, but you'd have to do something weird like go to channel 99 to get it to run. Anyway, it was just kind of a pain. So, and on top of that, the video quality was just awful even if you got it to work. Thank you, Krizz. He decided to fix this, because for years, the best thing you could do was modify it. You know, I actually showed these in some videos. I had an NES, or I still have it, that's RGB modified. There's HDMI ones. There's, of course, modern things like the retro USB, or retro AVS, which is an FPGA system that looks amazing. I've done a video on that. Then there was people who just think, the Retron 5 is good enough, which is just basically pirated emulators stuck in a box. I wouldn't recommend that. But anyway, so people are always looking for the solution. This is an amazing option if you are a actual hardcore enthusiast of original hardware. Just keep in mind that it does require a couple of extra steps. So what's the deal? What does the cartridge actually do? The cartridge essentially will just bypass the RF output of the system and give you a new way to output video signal, which is through RGB. Now, it's worth noting that the system doesn't actually have RGB internally. So if we were to compare it to something that was a contemporary rival, say the Sega Master System, Sega had the foresight to put RGB within the guts of the system originally, even if you had no way to access it back in the mid-80s. They still put it there. So as time went on, they could future-proof and they could upgrade and have new cables come out and everything could look better. And we take advantage of that in the modern day when even things like basic HDMI cables for things like the Genesis or the Master System, they just tap right in the RGB, plug and play and go. Nintendo didn't do that. They put in something called a PPU, which I don't think was entirely unique to the Famicom or NES, but in their case, it's within gaming context, it's relatively unique. It stands for Picture Processing Unit. And the PPU is kind of everything here, because not only do you have to have a compatible PPU with this device, which we'll talk a little bit more about, but it's also limited extremely in its way of displaying a picture. So it's worth noting that the Famicom and NES do not actually think in RGB at all. They have no such thing as an official, Nintendo never designed an official RGB color palette for the system. So for years, people have been coming up with mods, as I mentioned before, but every time they did that, they had to essentially invent what an RGB palette on the NES or Famicom would have looked like, because it never technically existed. That process has been refined and perfected over time, but it is ultimately technically unofficial. That doesn't mean it doesn't look good. It actually looks amazing, but it is worth noting that it is not technically official. Krizz ended up using, I think he used part of that work, or maybe did his own. I'm actually not totally sure what his process was specifically, and under the hood, I believe this uses an FPGA, essentially, and replicates those images, that image quality set. But regardless, it does offer a beautiful picture, and I just think it's worth noting that the cartridge is not tapping into some hidden signal within the system, essentially is what I'm saying. The cartridge is creating the RGB signal for you to enjoy, if that makes any sense. So once you have it, it's actually very simple to use. It's essentially you just plug it in and play. The cartridge itself is very basic. It really only has two elements to it. It has a USB port that is designed for firmware updates, which at the time I record this, there was a recent firmware update, and it's very simple. Krizz stuff always is very easy to update. And the only other thing on it is this DIN 9 mini RGB port, which is actually very nice because it's super convenient. That is the same port that exists on the Sega Mega Drive Model 2 and Sega Genesis Model 2, thus allowing and the 32X, that just allows you very easy access to things like HD Retrovision component cables, which is actually what I have set up here, as well as various SCART cables. Stupid easy. Like, you just plug it in and plug a cartridge on top of it. It's kind of like a Game Shark or a Game Genie in that regard. It's just, you see it set up there. There's not much to it. But the cartridge slot, like the video signal would then come off of the cartridge, no longer the system. You essentially just completely ignore the RF port on the back, and the power remains the same. You just power it as you always did. It doesn't require an additional power supply or anything like that. But as far as compatibility goes, it is designed specifically for a Nintendo original hardware that used the original PPU. Meaning, it'll work on a Famicom, it'll work on a Twin Sharp Famicom, it'll work on the AV Famicom. It will not work on things like the Retron 5 or other clone systems. I mean, there were so many clones of the NES. That's where the term Famiclones comes from, is because it was out of control. Now, you might find some individual ones where it does work. I'm not going to sit here and say there aren't any that will, but essentially Krizz would tell you it's not officially supported. If it works, great, that's a bonus. If it doesn't, it's because it wasn't meant to. But it is also worth noting that Nintendo changed that PPU a lot of different times. And while Krizz tried to make it as universally compatible as possible, there are actually some models that are technically incompatible. And there is a list of that on the website, on both Stone Age Gamer's website as well as Krizz's website, that puts down the model numbers of which ones don't work. Fortunately for me, mine all work just fine, which means it more often works than not, but it is technically worth noting. So let's say you're like, okay, I love the Famicom, I want to play these Famicom games and NES games, I want to play them in higher resolutions and cleaner picture and everything. Like, how do I do that? Well, first of all, it doesn't actually change the resolution. I wasn't totally sure how this was going to work. I was wondering if this thing had an upscaler in it or whatever, but it does not. So I reached out to Krizz specifically because I could not figure out what the output signal is, and he said straight up, it just outputs whatever the original source resolution it's getting is. So in the Famicom and NES's case, that would usually be 240p. Now here's the problem with 240p. 240p is a comically low resolution that most modern televisions will not understand. So if you're sitting there being like, okay, I've got HD Retrovision component cables, and I'm going to stick them right in the back of this thing, and I'm going to plug them into my 4K TV, and just turn on the Famicom and go, right? Probably not. As you can see here, while I'm trying that exact scenario on my television, you can hear the audio, but you can't see anything because the TV will not support such a low resolution through that type of input. I also tried it on an older ED TV. Now this TV could read it, but it also didn't technically understand 240p. It merely interpreted it as 480i. So while you get a signal, it is technically displaying the wrong resolution. So keep in mind that if you're doing this, it's not actually meant for modern televisions, but there is a workaround to that, which we'll get to in a second. What this is really intended for is people who want to use the system through, say, PVMs or CRTs. So if you're in North America and you have a big old CRT that has component input on it, congratulations, you're going to be really happy with this. If you're in Europe and you have a CRT that supports RGB SCART right on the system, congratulations, you're going to be very happy with this. But again, that there's a lot of just little asterisks on how you have to make this work depending on your setup. And I'm imagining if you're the type of person who's into this, you probably kind of know some of the ins and outs of what you need. So in my case, I want to use it on a modern setup. What I have here is a 1440p gaming monitor. So if I wanted to run it on this, what do I have to do? Well, first I'm going to power it all up, and then I will show you. Basically, the system is set up and is feeding into a RetroTink 5X. My particular setup is the HD Retrovision cable, as mentioned before, and then it feeds into that. And then, there you go, you can see it immediately. The RetroTink 5X takes the 240p signal and upscales it to 1080p, which is a much more basic modern resolution that the monitor has no problem understanding. And as you can see, it looks great. I'm going to kind of let it cycle, even though the lighting will be off a little bit, but you can just see how clean and clear the video signal actually is. This, by the way, is Super Sentai Jurenja, which was the basis of the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, which I grew up on, so I have no choice but to love. But I also put out various Famicom games there. It ran all of them no problem. I had no issue with it. The Star Wars one where Darth Vader, I believe, turns into a Godzilla or a Scorpion or something. There's a McDonald's game, Transformers game, Splatterhouse, some sort of King Kong game, etc. All of them ran just fine, and they look amazing. There was no issues with that. This monitor intentionally has sound disabled, but there are, obviously, the sound also comes out of the cartridge, and it sounds pretty good. It can change. It seemed to change based on what type of monitor I had it hooked up, though. Like, when I had it hooked up to the 4K, even though it had no video, the sound quality wasn't great, but it didn't matter because you couldn't see it. Whereas when I had it hooked up to the ED-TV, which could display it, the sound quality was better. I'm assuming that's a factor, but that might just be literally my own experience. But in general, when I was playing it, it was fine. And this, when I had a separate sound system hooked up, it also was fine as well. So, no problems there. But, yeah, so I'm going to turn it off here just so we can, don't have to deal with the color imbalance there, depower everything. So, now there's probably a few questions people would have, like, hey, can I run NES games on it? Yes and no, depending on how you do this. So this cartridge is specifically designed for the Famicom. Now, there are Famicom to NES cartridge adapters. I would imagine that you would have a really hard time trying to use this on, say, the original NES VCR model, just because of the shape of the cartridge and trying to get to it. I don't think that would really work. But I actually lack a cartridge adapter to really attempt that with. With the NES top loader, on the other hand, given its shape, that actually probably would work pretty well. But I don't know because I don't have the various cartridge adapters needed. I do know, however, that if you have an NES game, and you have an NES 72-pin to 60-pin converter that you can use on the Famicom, those will work, because again, you're using the Famicom specifically. So don't sit here and be like, hey, Adam said it would totally work on the NES. That's not what I'm saying. I can't verify that. But I do know in the other direction it will work. So this is really designed for people who want to have a Famicom, and they want to be able to play it in a more modern context. Just keep in mind that you have to have some extra pieces depending on how you're going to do this. All this does is give you a beautiful, clean 240p RGB signal out of the Famicom. That's it. After that, its job is done. It's on you to figure out what monitor or setup is compatible with that you want to use. Something like a PVM will work just fine immediately. Something like a CRT with component input or SCART input will work immediately. But if you want to use it on a more modern setup, you will need something like a RetroTink 5X or the RetroTink SCART model or a FrameMeister, etc., to update the upgrade and increase the resolution. Sorry, upscale, so that you can enjoy that. But yeah, just keep that in mind. You cannot just buy this and stick it directly into a 4K TV and expect it to work. It will not. It just won't, unless your TV is very unique. A computer monitor might. That's a different matter. But again, you'd have to have appropriate ports. So if you want this, and I do recommend it, it was seamless as far as video quality was great. It was lagless. I didn't notice any sort of issues like that. I had a lot of fun with it. It's really a nice way to actually use the Famicom. It was no longer an irritating experience to try and plug it in. And as I said, it worked with my other models, but keep in mind that there are various iterations where that's not the case. So while it is technically feasible that it can be compatible with various models of the NES and all that, it is intended for this original model of the Famicom and the AV Famicom, as well as the Sharp one. Just keep that in mind. But if you want to try and get creative and use it in other models, that's on you. But yeah, I think that about does it. Of course, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the comments, and I'll try my best to answer them. But yeah, honestly, no complaints here. It did what it was supposed to do right away. The only question I had was what was the output resolution. I was just curious if it did any upscaling. If I was gonna suggest anything for this, I would have suggested that it would have been nice to have some sort of pin adapter that is compatible with it, maybe that can go on the top or go on the bottom, that allows it to work in an NES and more natively, or allows NES games to just stick right in natively. That would have been my one, like, hey, maybe add that. But at the same time, you have to remember, Krizz is from Ukraine, where, I mean, in Europe in general, the NES was not popular, so those who really wanted it probably were more likely to be seeking the Japanese stuff, the Famicoms in general. So it makes kind of sense that he would have built it around that. So this is actually, funny enough, more aimed at, I would think, a European and Japanese audience than it is at an American audience, because an American audience and a Canadian audience is just going to need to do a few extra steps to actually take advantage of it. But it's all right there. All the pieces are there, and I think it's a pretty solid product. So huge shout out to Stone Age Gamer for sending one my way, and of course Krizz for being the god tier engineer that he is, for being able to just, hey, I'm bored, I'm just gonna solve the NES's like 40-year-old problem. Why not? So yeah, thank you very much to everyone involved in that. Thank you guys, of course, as always, for watching. If you guys do me a favor, please like the video, comment down below, subscribe if you've never done that before, and check out all the social media stuff in the description: Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Patreon, etc. Thank you so much, and I'll see you all later.